The world is not born equal. It was a lesson most children learn much later in life, perhaps when they realized they weren't as smart as the kids sitting next to them in math class, or not as fast as the anchor of the track team. But in a society where 80% of the population possessed an uncanny ability, a quirk, the disparity between humanity was worn on their very skin. Sometimes it was worn as a badge of honor, a flashy, beautiful power that promised the future of wealth, fame, and heroism. And sometimes it was worn as a curse. For Izuku Midoriya, the realization of this inherent inequality did not come with a gentle tap on the shoulder. It came with the sound of his own bones breaking, the tearing of his skin, and the terrified screams of the children he had once called his friends. Before the scales, before the teeth, before the towering mass of muscle and bone, Izuku Midoriya was just a boy with a profound, unyielding love for heroes. At 4 years old, his bedroom was a shrine to the symbol of peace. Posters of All Might adorned every square inch of the wallpaper, the hero's signature blinding smile beaming down on the small, freckled child who sat cross-legged on the carpet. Izuku would spend hours clutching his favorite action figure, swaying back and forth as he watched a grainy computer monitor play the same video on a loop. All Might's debut. Fear not, citizens. Hope has arrived. Because I am here. Izuku would mimic the laugh, a high-pitched, childish ha ha ha, and throw his small fist into the air. He was a small boy, remarkably plain, with unruly dark green hair and wide, bright green eyes that held the innocence of an untainted world. He was waiting for the day he would wake up and breathe fire like his father, or pull small objects toward him like his mother. Or maybe, just maybe, he would get a combination of both. Maybe he would get something entirely new. Katsuki Bakugo, his best friend, had already awakened his quirk. It was magnificent. Katsuki's palms popped and cracked with sweet-smelling explosions, bright and loud and impossible to ignore. It was a hero's quirk. Everyone said so. The teachers, the parents, the kids at the playground. Katsuki was destined for greatness, and Izuku, trailing just a few steps behind, couldn't wait to stand by his side. But the universe had a different plan. A violent, primal plan. It began on a Tuesday in late November. The weather had turned sharply cold, the first real chill of winter biting at the windows of the Midoriya apartment. Izuku had come home from preschool complaining of an ache in his lower back and a terrible, scratching sensation in his gums. Inko Midoriya, a fiercely loving mother with a soft face and a perpetually worried disposition, assumed it was a standard childhood ailment. Growing pains, perhaps, or a touch of the flu. She gave him children's ibuprofen, tucked him into his All Might bedsheets, and kissed his forehead. His skin felt unusually warm, almost feverish, but not dangerously so. Sleep, Izuku, she whispered, stroking his wild green curls. You'll feel better in the morning. He didn't. At 2:13 a.m., a scream tore through the quiet apartment. It was not a normal cry. It was a shriek of absolute, unadulterated agony, raw and guttural, sounding less like a 4-year-old boy and more like a wounded animal. Inko bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't even remember her feet hitting the floor. She scrambled down the hallway, throwing open Izuku's bedroom door. Izuku! Baby, what's wrong? The sight that greeted her would be burned into her retinas for the rest of her life. Izuku was thrashing on the bed, his small hands clutching his face. The sheets were stained with blood, so much blood. It was coming from his mouth. He spat, and small, pearl-white baby teeth clattered against the hardwood floor. They weren't just falling out. They were being violently pushed out from underneath by something else. Mommy! It hurts. It hurts so much. Izuku wailed, his voice cracking. He reached a hand out to her, and Inko gasped. His fingers. They were changing. The soft, chubby skin of his toddler hands was darkening, turning a deep, sickly shade of olive green. And it wasn't just the color. The texture was shifting right before her eyes, the skin hardening, cracking into diamond-shaped patterns. The webbing between his fingers was stretching, thickening. Oh my God! Oh my God! Inko chanted, rushing to the bed. She tried to grab his hand, but the moment her fingers brushed his skin, Izuku screamed again, arching his back. Crack! A sickening popping sound echoed in the small room. It came from the base of his spine. Izuku's pajamas tore. From his tailbone, a mass of flesh and cartilage was pushing outward, forcing its way through his skin. It was a tail. Thick, heavy, and lined with jagged, rising ridges. As the tail grew, pushing down onto the mattress, Izuku's body convulsed. His face was elongating. The bones in his jaw cracked and shifted, pulling his face forward into a heavy, blunt snout. New teeth, dozens of them, razor-sharp and slightly curved, pierced through his bleeding gums, tearing the inside of his own mouth. His bright green, round eyes narrowed, the pupils contracting from circles into vertical, predatory slits. This was not a normal quirk awakening. Emitter quirks, like Katsuki's, usually manifested with a small spark. Transformation quirks might cause a brief moment of disorientation, but mutant quirks, true, heavy heteromorphic mutations, could be brutal if they were not inherited directly from a parent. Izuku's body was entirely rewriting its own genetic code in a matter of hours, tearing down the soft human boy and forcefully constructing something ancient and terrifying in his place. "Mommy!" Izuku gurgled, blood spilling over his new, terrifyingly sharp teeth. His voice was deeper now, rumbling with a strange, reptilian hiss. Please." Inko didn't hesitate. She didn't scream, and she didn't pull away in disgust. She was a mother. She threw her arms around the thrashing, hardening body of her son, pressing him to her chest even as the new, sharp scuts on his back cut into her forearms. "I'm here, Izuku." "Mommy's here," she sobbed, using her weak telekinesis to summon her phone from the kitchen. She dialed emergency services with trembling fingers, her voice frantic. "Please! My son, his quirk is coming in, and it's tearing him apart. Send an ambulance." The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing red lights and the coppery smell of blood. The paramedics, seasoned professionals accustomed to bizarre quirk manifestations, were visibly taken aback when they loaded the boy onto the stretcher. He was heavier than a 4-year-old should be, his muscle density rapidly increasing to support the massive, armored tail thrashing in agony behind him. Inko held his clawed, webbed hand the entire way, weeping as she felt the body heat rapidly draining from him. He was becoming cold to the touch. His core temperature is dropping. A paramedic shouted over the siren. "Get thermal blankets on him, now! I think his metabolism is shifting. He's becoming cold-blooded." Izuku's vision was swimming. The bright lights of the ambulance hurt his eyes. Every sound was magnified. He could hear the thrumming heartbeat of the paramedic sitting across from him, the rush of blood in the man's veins. He could feel the vibrations of the ambulance tires on the asphalt translating up through the stretcher and into tiny, sensitive pits that had opened along his newly formed jawline. It was too much. The pain, the noise, the cold. Izuku squeezed his mother's hand, his new claws accidentally piercing the skin of her palm. He let out a low, crocodilian growl of distress, and then mercifully he passed out. The sterile white walls of the hospital room offered no comfort. Izuku sat on the edge of the examination table, his legs dangling over the side. He was clad in a hospital gown that had to be specially modified, a slit cut up the back to accommodate the thick, heavy tail that now rested on the linoleum floor. It had been 2 days since the awakening. The excruciating pain had subsided into a dull, constant ache, a phantom reminder that his skeleton was no longer entirely human. Inko sat in a plastic chair in the corner, her eyes red and puffy. She looked exhausted, her hair unkempt, a bandage wrapped around her hand where Izuku had accidentally cut her. Izuku stared at the bandage. A heavy, dark feeling settled in his chest. He had hurt his mom. Heroes didn't hurt their moms. He looked down at his own hands. They weren't his anymore. They were massive, thick-fingered, covered in deep, forest-green scales that felt like smooth pebbles. Heavy, sharp claws extended from the fingertips, black as obsidian. He reached up, tentatively touching his face. His fingers traced the long, hardened bridge of his snout, the rough, bony ridges above his eyes, and the jagged line of teeth that protruded even when his mouth was closed. He didn't look like All Might. He didn't look like an action figure. He looked like the monsters the heroes fought in the cartoons. The door clicked open, and Dr. Tsubasa walked in. He was a short, balding man with thick goggles and a clipboard, an old acquaintance of the family. He looked over the rim of his glasses at Izuku, his expression unreadable, a purely clinical fascination in his eyes. Fascinating, Dr. Tsubasa muttered, flipping through a thick stack of medical charts. Truly unprecedented. Neither you nor Hisashi possess any heteromorphic traits in your immediate lineage, Inko. This is a severe recessive mutation. A prime example of the Quirk singularity theory at work, the blending of dormant genetics creating an entirely new, highly powerful physiology. Is he going to be okay, doctor? Inko asked, her voice trembling. He's so cold to the touch. And he hasn't spoken a word since he woke up. Dr. Tsubasa nodded, stepping closer to Izuku. He reached out to touch the scales on Izuku's arm, but Izuku flinched, pulling away with a low, instinctual hiss. The doctor paused, then lowered his hand. Physically? He is in perfect health. In fact, he is overwhelmingly robust, the doctor explained. His quirk is a heavy mutant type. I would classify it under the Crocodile family, an apex predator mutation. His skin is reinforced with osteoderms, bony plates that act as natural armor. It is currently tough enough to deflect a standard kitchen knife, and as he grows, it may become impervious to low-caliber gunfire. Inko gasped, covering her mouth. Gunfire? He's a 4-year-old boy. He is a biological marvel, Dr. Tsubasa corrected smoothly. His jaw structure is completely remodeled. Even now, his bite force is likely triple that of an adult human. By the time he reaches maturity, he will have a bite force rivaling a true saltwater crocodile, upwards of 4,000 pounds per square inch. He could snap a steel pipe in half like a twig. The doctor flipped a page. However, there are drawbacks. His physiology is now fundamentally reptilian. He is ectothermic. Cold-blooded. He cannot regulate his own body heat effectively. In cold environments, he will become lethargic, sluggish, and if exposed too long, he could slip into a state of bramation, a deep sleep. He will need heat lamps, thermal clothing, and a high-protein diet. Raw meat, preferably, with bones intact for calcium. Izuku stared at the floor. Raw meat. Biting through steel. Cold-blooded, Dr. Inko said, her voice dropping to a whisper. What about his mind? He hissed at you. Is his brain changing too? Dr. Tsubasa sighed, tapping his pen against the clipboard. The brain is part of the body, Inko. While Izuku's human consciousness, his intellect, and his personality are intact, he is now flooded with the instincts of an apex predator. His sensory pits, the doctor pointed to the small, barely visible dots lining Izuku's jaw, allow him to detect minute vibrations in the air and water. His brain is wired to track movement, to react aggressively to threats, and to establish dominance. He will have to learn to control these instincts, or they will control him. The doctor looked directly at Izuku. You have been given a very powerful, very dangerous body, young man. You must be exceedingly careful. A simple temper tantrum from you could result in severe, fatal injuries to another child. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Fatal injuries. Izuku's lip trembled. He looked up at his mother, his vertical slit pupils wide with fear. Mommy! He croaked, his voice deep and raspy. Am I a bad guy now? Inko broke. She rushed across the room, ignoring the doctor, ignoring the sharp scales and the terrifying teeth, and wrapped her arms around her son's thick neck. She buried her face in his shoulder, sobbing. No, Izuku. No, my sweet boy, she cried, kissing his scaly cheek. You are good. You are so good. Mommy loves you. You're my little hero. Izuku closed his eyes, hugging her back, being careful to keep his sharp claws pointed away from her fragile skin. He wanted to believe her. He really did. But as he looked over her shoulder, catching his reflection in the dark, unlit screen of the medical monitor on the wall, he didn't see a hero. He saw a monster staring back. Returning to normal life was impossible. The Midoriya household adapted out of necessity. Inko bought industrial space heaters, placing them in Izuku's room and the living room. She changed his diet, buying bulk chicken and fish, watching with a mixture of awe and unease as her 4-year-old son unhinged his jaw slightly to crush whole chicken bones with a sickening crunch. Izuku hated it. He hated the noise he made when he ate. He hated the heavy, dragging weight of his tail, which knocked over vases and bumped into tables no matter how hard he tried to control it. He hated that he couldn't wear his favorite All Might hoodies anymore because they wouldn't fit over his dorsal ridges. But most of all, he hated the way people looked at him. When Inko finally deemed him well enough to return to the neighborhood playground, Izuku was a bundle of nervous energy. He wore a specially knitted, oversized sweater Inko had made, a hole cut out for his tail. It was a crisp December afternoon, the air biting. Izuku felt sluggish, his blood moving slowly in his veins, but the promise of seeing Kaken pushed him forward. They approached the park. The sounds of children laughing and shouting echoed in the air. Katsuki Bakugo was holding court by the sandbox, popping small explosions in his palms as 3 other boys watched in awe. "Kaken!" Izuku called out, a smile pulling at his elongated jaw. Katsuki stopped. The other boys turned. The laughter died instantly. Izuku froze. The silence was palpable. Mothers sitting on the nearby benches stopped chatting, their eyes widening in alarm. Several stood up, instinctively taking a step toward their children. "Deku?" Katsuki asked, squinting. He dropped his hands, the explosions fizzling out. He walked closer, his crimson eyes scanning Izuku's towering, mutated form. Izuku was now a full head taller than Katsuki, his shoulders broad and thick. "Yeah. It's me," Izuku said, taking a step forward. His heavy tail thumped against the sand. "My quirk came in, Kaken. Look!" Izuku held up his scaly, clawed hands. He meant it as a gesture of excitement, a sharing of joy. But to the children staring at him, it looked like a threat. One of the boys behind Katsuki, a kid with small, leathery wings, stepped back, trembling. "What is that thing? He looks like a villain from the TV." "I'm not a villain," Izuku said quickly, his voice naturally dropping into a deep, booming register that startled even him. "He's a monster!" Another kid yelled, pointing. "Shut up, extras!" Katsuki snapped, though his eyes never left Izuku's face. There was a strange look in Katsuki's eyes. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was revulsion. And something else, a sudden, deep-seated need to assert dominance. Katsuki was the king of the playground. He was the hero. And heroes fought monsters. Before Katsuki could speak, a young boy running by with a plastic shovel tripped over the thick, exposed root of an oak tree. The boy went flying, scraping his knees hard against the gravel path. He burst into tears. Izuku's instincts flared. Someone was hurt. A hero always helps someone who is hurt. "Are you okay?" Izuku asked, rushing forward. He was clumsy in his new body, his center of gravity completely thrown off by his heavy tail. He knelt down next to the crying boy, reaching out a hand to help him up. "Here, let me." Izuku's thick, webbed hand brushed against the boy's arm. He didn't mean to squeeze. He just wanted to help him stand. But Izuku had not yet learned to control the immense strength in his new muscles, nor did he realize how sharp his obsidian claws truly were. The moment his claws pressed against the boy's skin, they pierced the fabric of his sleeve and cut a shallow, bloody line down the child's forearm. The boy looked at his bleeding arm, then looked up at the terrifying, scaly, toothy face looming over him. The boy let out a blood-curdling scream. "He bit me! The monster bit me! No! No, I didn't!" Izuku panicked, scrambling backward. "I'm sorry! I just tried to help." Suddenly, a blinding flash of light and heat erupted in Izuku's face. Boom! The explosion wasn't large, but it was close enough to singe the edge of Izuku's sweater and send him tumbling backward into the dirt. Izuku blinked, his sensitive eyes watering from the smoke and the sharp smell of burnt caramel and ozone. Standing over him, his palms smoking and a fierce, righteous scowl on his face, was Katsuki Bakugo. "Get away from him, you villain!" Katsuki yelled, puffing out his chest. The playground erupted into cheers. The other children rallied behind Katsuki, throwing handfuls of sand and small pebbles at Izuku. "Yeah! Get him, Bakugo! Beat the monster! Go away, villain!" Izuku sat in the dirt, the pebbles pinging harmlessly off his armored scales. They didn't hurt his body, but they shattered his heart. He looked at Katsuki, his best friend, who was staring down at him not with the camaraderie of a fellow hero in training, but with the triumphant glare of a hero who had just vanquished a beast. Keikaken. Izuku whimpered, a tear slipping from his reptilian eye. Don't call me that, swamp trash, Katsuki spat, the nickname cementing itself into reality in an instant. Heroes don't hang out with gross lizards who hurt people. If you know what's good for you, stay out of my way. Izuku. Inko had run across the park, pushing past the crowd of glaring parents. She threw herself in front of Izuku, shielding his massive frame with her small one. She glared at Katsuki, then at the other parents. Shame on you! Inko yelled, her voice breaking with fury and sorrow. He is a child. He's just a little boy. Keep that animal on a leash, Midoriya, one of the mothers sneered, pulling her crying son away. He belongs in a sewer, not a playground. Inko grabbed Izuku's clawed hand, her grip tight and trembling. Come on, Izuku. We're going home. Izuku didn't fight her. He let her pull him up, his tail dragging through the dirt, leaving a long, serpentine trail behind him. He looked back over his shoulder one last time. Katsuki was standing tall, surrounded by adoring kids, bathing in the glory of being the hero. Izuku lowered his heavy, ugly head. The world had spoken. The lines were drawn. Katsuki was the hero. And Izuku. Izuku was the monster. The walk home was silent. The cold air felt like ice water in Izuku's veins, making his movements sluggish and heavy. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the freezing numbness in his chest. When they reached the apartment, Inko immediately turned on all the space heaters. She ran a warm bath, gently guiding Izuku into the tub. The warm water helped chase away the physical chill, but Izuku remained entirely unresponsive. He sat in the water, staring blankly at the tiled wall, the water lapping against the thick scales of his chest. Inko washed his hair, her tears mixing with the bathwater. She didn't speak. There were no words that could fix what had just happened. Hero society was cruel to those who didn't fit the mold, and heteromorph prejudice was an ugly, unspoken reality that she had desperately hoped her son would never have to face. After he was dry and dressed in a fresh, warm sweater, Izuku retreated to his room. He stood in the center of the room, looking at the posters. All Might. The symbol of peace. The man who saved everyone with a smile. All Might was beautiful. He was muscular, yes, but human. Bright blonde hair, dazzling blue eyes, a cape that fluttered in the wind. When people looked at All Might, they felt safe. Izuku walked over to his mirror. He looked at himself. He tried to smile. The result was horrifying. His jaw parted, revealing rows of jagged, overlapping teeth. His cheeks couldn't stretch like a human's, so the smile looked more like a feral snarl, a predator baring its fangs in anticipation of a kill. The vertical slits of his pupils gave him a cold, soulless expression. He looks like a villain from the TV. Izuku reached up and gripped the edge of an All Might poster. With one swift, heartbreaking pull, he tore it off the wall. He did it again. And again. He went around the room, tearing down every smiling face, every bright color, until the walls were bare. He gathered his action figures and shoved them into a cardboard box, pushing the box deep into his closet. He couldn't be like All Might. It was a lie. If he tried to smile at someone, they would run away screaming. He had hurt a kid just by touching him. He was a monster. Izuku crawled to his computer desk. He booted up the old machine, his thick fingers clumsily navigating the mouse. He usually opened the browser and typed in All Might debut. This time, his claws hovered over the keyboard. Slowly, painfully, he typed Scary Heroes. He hit enter. The search engine populated with articles and forum posts. Most of them were opinion pieces about whether heteromorphic heroes should be allowed to work in daylight hours, or if their appearances were too disturbing for public morale. It made Izuku's stomach twist. But then, a video thumbnail caught his eye. It was titled, Gang Orca Stops Bank Robbery in Yokohama. Izuku clicked it. The video was shaky, recorded on a civilian's phone. A group of men with mutation and emitter quirks were holding up a bank. The police were pinned down behind their cruisers. A man was crying on the sidewalk, having been thrown out of the bank. Suddenly, the pavement shook. A towering figure stepped into the frame. It was a man, but he looked like an absolute nightmare. He was massive, dressed in a sleek white suit, but his head was that of a killer whale. He had dead, black, soulless eyes, and a mouth full of terrifying, conical teeth. He looked more imposing, more villainous, than any of the robbers. The robbers turned, laughing at the newcomer. "What's this? The aquarium spring a leak?" Gang Orca didn't speak. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a reassuring platitude. He simply stepped forward, his presence suffocating the street in an aura of sheer, unadulterated intimidation. He unleashed a hypersonic wave that shattered the glass of the bank and brought the robbers to their knees, clutching their bleeding ears. With brutal, calculated efficiency, Gang Orca moved through the criminals, knocking them unconscious with heavy, bone-crushing strikes. He was ruthless. He was terrifying. He fought like a monster. When the last villain fell, the street was dead silent. The civilians were shaking, clearly terrified of the massive whale man who stood amidst the carnage. Gang Orca turned. He walked toward the man who had been thrown out of the bank earlier. The man scrambled backward, putting his hands up in fear. Please! Don't hurt me!" the civilian cried. Gang Orca stopped. He looked down at the man. His terrifying face didn't change. But slowly, gently, Gang Orca reached out his massive, gloved hand. He didn't force the man to take it. He just offered it. "The threat has been neutralized," Gang Orca said, his voice a deep, reverberating baritone that commanded absolute respect. "You are safe now." The civilian hesitated, looking from the defeated villains to the monstrous hero. Slowly, the fear in the man's eyes faded, replaced by awe. He took Gang Orca's hand and let the hero pull him to his feet. Gang Orca gave a curt, polite nod, adjusted his tie, and walked away. Izuku stared at the screen, his breath hitching. Gang Orca didn't smile. He didn't try to look friendly. He used his terrifying nature to break the villains, to make the bad guys feel the fear they inflicted on others. He was a monster to the wicked, and a shield for the innocent. "Izuku?" Inko stood in the doorway, holding a tray with a warm mug of broth. She looked at the bare walls, her heart breaking all over again. She saw the box of All Might figures in the closet. Then, she looked at the computer screen. Izuku turned around in his chair. Tears were streaming down his scaly cheeks, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of absolute despair. "Mom!" Izuku rumbled, pointing a claw at the paused video of Gang Orca. He looked scary. Inko walked into the room, setting the tray on the desk. She looked at the screen, then at her son. "Yes, honey. He does look a little scary." "The bad guys were afraid of him," Izuku said softly. "They were." Izuku looked down at his own dark green hands, flexing his obsidian claws. "Kaken said I'm a monster. The other kids said I'm a villain." He looked up at Inko, his vertical pupils dilated with a desperate, burning hope. But maybe," Izuku took a deep breath, "maybe I don't have to be a hero who makes people smile." Inko knelt beside him, taking his large, heavy hands in hers. She ignored the sharpness of his claws. She looked directly into his terrifying, predatory eyes and saw the gentle, beautiful soul of her little boy shining through. "Maybe," Izuku whispered, "I can be a hero who makes the bad guys tremble." Inko smiled, tears spilling over her cheeks. She squeezed his hands. "I think that is a wonderful idea, Izuku. I think you are going to be the greatest hero this world has ever seen." Izuku didn't smile. He couldn't. But deep in his chest, a low, thrumming purr vibrated through his scales, a crocodilian sound of absolute comfort. He was a monster. But he was going to be their monster. 10 years later. Aldera Junior High was not a prestigious school, but it was loud. The hallways were always packed with rowdy teenagers showing off minor emitter quirks or comparing grades. But there was one unwritten rule at Aldera, an undeniable law of physics that governed the flow of traffic in the corridors. When Izuku Midoriya walked down the hall, the crowd parted. It wasn't a conscious choice made by the students. It was pure, biological instinct. Deep in the lizard brain of every human being was a switch that recognized an apex predator, and Izuku flipped that switch the moment he entered a room. At 14 years old, Izuku was a leviathan. He stood at a staggering 6'5", his body packed with dense, corded muscle designed to propel him through water and crush bone. His dark, forest green scales had thickened into impenetrable armor plates across his shoulders, back, and forearms. His jaw had broadened, giving him a permanent, heavy scowl, and his teeth, thick, conical, and razor-sharp, occasionally slipped past his lips, gleaming white against his dark skin. His tail, nearly as long as he was tall, dragged heavily behind him, a massive limb of muscle and bone that swayed with a hypnotic, rhythmic thump, swish, thump against the linoleum floor. He wore the standard Aldera uniform, but it was heavily modified. The sleeves were torn off to accommodate his massive biceps and dorsal ridges, and he wore a thick, insulated thermal vest underneath the shirt to keep his cold-blooded body from shutting down in the air-conditioned building. "Make way," a second-year student whispered frantically, pulling his friend against the lockers. "It's him. The swamp beast." Izuku ignored the whispers. He kept his head down, his broad shoulders hunched forward in a perpetual attempt to make himself look smaller. He held a charred, battered notebook delicately between two massive claws, furiously scribbling notes, with a tiny pencil that looked comical in his grip. Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13. Despite his terrifying exterior, Izuku had not changed on the inside. He was still a massive, stuttering nerd. He spent his afternoons tracking villain fights, analyzing quirks, and studying combat tactics. He had to. He knew that if he was going to take the UA entrance exam, he couldn't rely on raw power alone. His quirk was destructive, lethal even. He needed absolute control, absolute precision, if he wanted to subdue villains without accidentally biting them in half. He reached classroom 3A, having to duck his head sideways to clear the doorframe. The chatter in the room died down slightly as he entered. Izuku walked to his desk at the back of the room, near the radiator. He carefully pulled out his chair, sitting down with a heavy sigh that sounded like a low hiss, wrapping his tail around the base of the chair so nobody would trip over it. "Hey, look at the lizard," someone muttered a few desks over. "Think he ate a stray dog for breakfast again? I heard he sleeps in a bathtub full of mud." Izuku pretended not to hear. He opened his notebook and began sketching a diagram of Empty Lady's center of gravity during her gigantification process. Suddenly, the smell of burnt sugar and ozone hit Izuku's sensory pits. His pupils immediately contracted into tight slits, his heart rate spiking. Thump! A pair of feet clad in combat boots kicked up onto Izuku's desk, knocking his pencil away. Izuku looked up. Katsuki Bakugo sneered down at him, his red eyes burning with a mixture of arrogance and deep-seated irritation. Katsuki had grown into a fierce, athletic teenager, his explosion quirk more powerful and volatile than ever. He was the undisputed king of Aldera, the golden boy destined for UA High, and he hated Izuku with a burning passion. "What are you scribbling, swamp trash?" Katsuki demanded, leaning forward, small pops of explosive sweat crackling in his palms. "Still playing pretend?" Izuku carefully picked up his pencil, avoiding eye contact. If he locked eyes with Katsuki, his reptilian instincts would read it as a challenge, and he had spent 10 years learning how to suppress the urge to bite. "Just taking notes, Bakugo," Izuku rumbled softly, his voice a deep, gravelly bass. "Notes for what? You planning on being a villain?" Katsuki laughed, and the rest of his cronies chimed in. "Because let's face it, Deku. The only place a monster like you is going is Tartarus. They don't let kaijus into UA." Izuku's claws dug slightly into the wood of the desk, leaving 4 small indentations. "UA doesn't ban heteromorphs," Izuku said quietly, keeping his temper in check. "Gang Orca went to a hero school. Hound Dog went to UA. I'm going to apply." Katsuki slammed his hands down on the desk, right next to Izuku's face. The wood scorched, a small explosion rocking the table. The classroom went dead silent. "Listen to me, you overgrown gecko," Katsuki snarled, his face inches from Izuku's elongated snout. "I'm going to be the only one from this crappy school to make it to UA. I'm going to surpass All Might, and I am not going to have my origin story tainted by a villainous freak like you trying to tag along. So you're going to withdraw your application, or I'm going to turn you into a matching set of boots and a handbag. Got it?" Izuku closed his eyes. He could hear Katsuki's heartbeat. He could feel the heat radiating from Katsuki's palms. If he wanted to, Izuku could unhinge his jaw, grab Katsuki by the collar, and throw him through the concrete wall of the classroom. The intrusive, predatory thought flashed through his mind, fueled by the biological imperative to establish dominance. Bite. Thrash. Break. Izuku took a slow, deep breath, forcing the animal back into its cage. He opened his eyes, looking at Katsuki not with anger, but with a weary, profound sadness. I'm going to Yue, Bakugo, Izuku said, his voice quiet but carrying a heavy, vibrating timbre that rattled the windows. I'm going to be a hero. Katsuki glared at him for a long moment, a vein pulsing in his forehead. He scoffed, kicking the desk one last time before turning away. Whatever, swamp trash. Just don't cry when the pros put you down like a rabid animal during the exam. The teacher walked in, ending the confrontation. Izuku exhaled a long breath, a small wisp of condensation escaping his nostrils due to his cold-blooded nature reacting to the room's AC. He looked down at his notebook. The cover was slightly scorched from Katsuki's explosion. Izuku smoothed it out with his massive thumb. Katsuki was right about one thing. The world didn't want monsters to be heroes. They wanted shining smiles, bright colors, and comforting words. The system was rigged against those who looked like the villains they were supposed to fight. But Izuku didn't care anymore. He didn't need to be loved by the masses. He didn't need a fan club, or merchandise, or to be the #1 hero on the Billboard charts. He just needed to be strong enough to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The bell rang, signaling the end of the day. As the students rushed out, giving Izuku a wide berth, the boy slowly packed his bag. He slung it over his broad, armored shoulder, his heavy tail dragging behind him as he stepped out into the afternoon sun. He was Izuku Midoriya. He was a monster, and he was going to save the world. The bell ending the school day at Aldera Junior High didn't just signal freedom for the students. For Izuku Midoriya, it signaled a brief, necessary respite from the suffocating pressure of being a walking nightmare. The walk home was a calculated routine. Izuku always waited 10 minutes after the final bell before leaving his classroom, ensuring the hallways were mostly empty. He didn't want to accidentally step on a first-year student, nor did he want to deal with the inevitable stares, the whispered insults, or the way the younger kids pressed themselves against the lockers as if he were about to unhinge his jaw and swallow them whole. Today was colder than usual for early April. The sky was an overcast, bruised purple, threatening rain. For a normal teenager, the chill was an inconvenience to be solved with a light jacket. For Izuku, whose physiology had completely rewritten itself into that of an ectothermic apex predator, the cold was a physical weight. His blood moved sluggishly. A deep, bone-deep lethargy seeped into his joints. Every step he took required conscious effort, his massive, digitigrade legs feeling like they were encased in wet cement. His heavy, armored tail, nearly 5 feet of dense muscle and jagged scuts, dragged loudly behind him, scraping against the concrete sidewalk with a rhythmic, grating skrt thump. He pulled the collar of his custom-made thermal jacket up higher, wishing his snout didn't protrude so far forward. The cold air bit at the sensitive sensory pits lining his upper and lower jaw. These tiny biological receptors were designed to detect minute vibrations in water and air, allowing him to track prey blindly. Right now, they were just picking up the harsh vibrations of rush-hour traffic and the distant rumble of the train line. Just don't cry when the pros put you down like a rabid animal during the exam. Katsuki's words echoed in his mind, wrapping around his heart like barbed wire. Izuku let out a long, rumbling sigh, a cloud of white condensation pluming from his nostrils. He clutched his charred hero notebook in his massive, webbed hand. He had spent the last 10 years trying to prove that he wasn't a beast. He didn't roar. He spoke softly, politely, constantly apologizing for his size. He kept his razor-sharp claws filed down as best as he could, though they always grew back tougher. He slouched to appear shorter, but it was never enough. Society had an image of what a hero should be, and Izuku was the antithesis of it. To avoid the chilling wind, Izuku decided to take a shortcut through a pedestrian underpass. The concrete tunnel was damp and poorly lit, smelling faintly of stagnant water and mildew. It was the kind of place most people avoided, but for Izuku, the damp darkness felt strangely comforting. It smelled like the marshland enclosures he sometimes saw in documentaries, an environment his body was fundamentally built for. His heavy boots echoed against the walls. Thud. Thud. Then, his sensory pits twitched. It wasn't a sound. It was a shift in the air pressure. A vibration coming from directly beneath him, vibrating through the concrete grating of a nearby manhole cover. Izuku stopped. His vertical slit pupils dilated, adjusting to the gloom in a fraction of a second. His reptilian brain, always lurking just beneath his conscious thought, flared to life. Threat. Before he could even turn his heavy head, the manhole cover blasted upward, propelled by a geyser of foul-smelling, dark green sludge. The sludge didn't just spill, it moved with terrible purpose, rising into a towering, gelatinous mass. Two massive, bulbous eyes rolled to the surface of the fluid, fixing on Izuku's towering frame. A jagged mouth formed in the muck, revealing uneven, yellowish teeth. Well, 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 the sludge villain gurgled, his voice sounding like a drowning man speaking through mud. What do we have here? A medium-sized meat suit? No, wait, you're a big one. A real monster. Oh, this is perfect. With a body like this, I could rip that blonde bastard into pieces. Izuku took a step back, dropping his notebook. His heart hammered in his chest, pumping slow, cold blood. He raised his arms defensively. Wait! Stay back! The villain lunged. A tidal wave of sentient sewage crashed into Izuku. The sheer kinetic force of the impact would have thrown a normal human against the wall, breaking their spine. But Izuku weighed nearly 400 pounds, his center of gravity anchored by his massive tail. He merely skidded backward a few inches, his boots grinding against the pavement. Don't fight it, kid! The sludge villain cackled, wrapping thick tendrils of muck around Izuku's arms and torso. It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds. Then, it's all mine. The sludge surged upward, forcing its way over Izuku's face, aiming for his nose and mouth. The villain was trying to hijack his body from the inside out, suffocating him in the process. Panic seized Izuku's human mind, but his crocodilian biology reacted with cold, mechanical efficiency. As the sludge poured into his open jaws, a specialized flap of tissue at the back of his throat, the palatal valve, slammed completely shut. It was an evolutionary trait designed to allow crocodiles to open their mouths underwater to catch prey without drowning. The sludge pooled in his mouth, entirely blocked from entering his trachea or lungs. What the? The sludge villain sputtered. Why won't it go down? Open your throat, you stupid beast. Izuku couldn't breathe, his nasal passages blocked, but he didn't need to. Thanks to his immense lung capacity, built for long, submerged ambushes, he could hold his breath for over an hour. Anger, primal and hot, began to burn through the cold lethargy in Izuku's veins. He wasn't just a victim. He was an apex predator. Izuku's jaws clamped shut. Crunch. His teeth, capable of generating 4,000 pounds of pressure per square inch, bit down hard on the sludge trapped in his mouth. He couldn't chew liquid, but the sheer kinetic shockwave of his jaws snapping together sent a concussive ripple through the villain's fluid body. The sludge villain shrieked in pain. Gah! You bit me? How the hell did you hurt me? Izuku didn't answer. He freed his right arm from the muck, his thick muscles bulging against his thermal shirt. He raised his hand, extending his obsidian claws, and slashed furiously at the villain's central mass, aiming for the eyes. His claws tore through the fluid like knives through jelly, forcing the villain to recoil. You feral freak! The villain roared, trying to tighten his grip on Izuku's chest. I'll crush your ribs, Izuku grunted, planting his feet. The villain was squeezing hard, but Izuku's torso was protected by thick, osteoderm-reinforced scales. The pressure was uncomfortable, like a tight blood pressure cuff, but his ribs were nowhere near breaking. Izuku raised both hands, digging his claws into the villain's sludge, trying to rip him apart. It was a stalemate. Izuku was too tough to possess, and the villain was too fluid to grapple effectively. Suddenly, a massive shockwave rattled the tunnel. The heavy iron grate at the entrance of the underpass was blown clean off its hinges. The sludge villain froze. Izuku, still holding his breath, turned his heavy head. Standing at the entrance of the tunnel, illuminated by the dim streetlights behind him, was a silhouette that Izuku had memorized from 1,000 posters, 1,000 videos, 1,000 dreams. Fear not, young man. A booming, earth-shattering voice echoed through the concrete. The figure stepped forward, moving with a speed that defied his massive bulk. The wind whipped around him, his bright blonde hair standing up in two iconic tufts. A smile, blinding and resolute, was plastered across his face. "For I am here, All Might!" The sludge villain shrieked in absolute terror, releasing his grip on Izuku and launching a whip-like tendril of sludge at the number 1 hero. Texas. All Might pulled his right arm back. The air around his fist seemed to warp and distort from the sheer pressure. Smash! He threw the punch. He didn't hit the villain. He hit the air. The resulting wind pressure was equivalent to an F5 tornado detonating in an enclosed space. The sheer force of the gale hit the sludge villain, violently scattering his fluid body into a million droplets of harmless muck. The wind hit Izuku next. Despite his immense weight and armored body, the shockwaves swept him off his feet. His heavy frame slammed into the curved wall of the tunnel, sliding down to the pavement. The wind knocked the breath from his lungs, breath he had been holding. The sudden intake of oxygen, combined with the sheer adrenaline and the overwhelming shock of seeing his idol, proved too much for his brain to process. Izuku's vision swam, blurring into darkness. The last thing he saw was a massive, brightly colored figure rushing toward him. Smack! 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 Hey! Hey, wake up! Come on, young beast man, Izuku groaned. His head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. The first thing he registered was a stinging sensation on his scaly cheek. He blinked, his vertical pupils contracting sharply as the dull light of the tunnel flooded his vision. Hovering over him was All Might. The hero was lightly slapping his face, though All Might's light slaps felt like getting hit with a baseball bat. "Ah, good! You're awake!" All Might boomed, stepping back and flashing that trademark, blinding smile. "Thought we lost you there. Sorry about the rough handling. You've got quite the sturdy constitution, my boy. A lesser civilian might have been crushed by that villain." Izuku scrambled backward, his heavy tail whipping around and slamming into the wall as he tried to stand. He was clumsy, hyperventilating. It was him. It was really him. All Might! Izuku's deep voice cracked, sounding like two boulders grinding together. "Why, you're really here? In person? Oh my God, I need an autograph. Where's my notebook?" Izuku frantically scanned the ground, spotting his charred notebook lying in a puddle of residual sludge. He scooped it up, flipping to a blank page with his massive claws, trying not to rip the delicate paper. But as he looked down, he saw a massive, bold signature taking up 2 entire pages. "Already did it?" All Might laughed, giving a thumbs up. "Now, I must be off. I have to get this villain to the authorities." All Might patted his cargo pants, where 2 large, empty soda bottles were now filled to the brim with the captured sludge villain, securely capped. "Wait!" Izuku rumbled, taking a step forward. "Already? But I have so many questions. I need to ask you." "No time for questions, young man. A hero is constantly battling both villains and the clock. Stay out of trouble." All Might crouched down, the muscles in his legs bulging impossibly tight. He was about to jump. Izuku's mind went blank. The logical part of his brain, the part that analyzed quirks and understood physics, was screaming that doing anything right now was a terrible idea. But his instincts, the primal drive that compelled him to act before thinking, took over. As All Might launched himself into the sky like a ballistic missile, Izuku lunged. He didn't grab the hero with his hands. His claws might pierce All Might's skin. Instead, he spun his massive body, whipping his heavy tail forward and wrapping it securely around All Might's thick thigh just as the hero cleared the tunnel entrance. The force of the jump violently jerked Izuku into the air. "GGAH!" Izuku roared, the wind immediately tearing at his face as they rocketed hundreds of feet into the sky above the city. "Hey, hey, hey!" All Might shouted, looking down in shock. "What do you think you're doing, you crazy kid? Let go! Your tail is crushing my leg. If I let go now, I'll die." Izuku screamed back, his deep voice carrying over the rushing wind. His heavy, armored body was aerodynamic in water, but in the air, he was a flying brick. He clung to All Might's leg for dear life, his tail coiled tight. Right. Just hold on tightly. And close your eyes and mouth. A few terrifying seconds later, the rushing wind ceased as All Might aimed for the roof of a 3-story commercial building. They landed with a heavy, bone-rattling thud. Izuku immediately uncoiled his tail, collapsing onto the tarred rooftop, his chest heaving. Good grief, All Might sighed, brushing himself off. That was incredibly reckless, young man. You have a powerful mutation, but falling from that height would crack even those scales. Now I must really be going. Wait! Izuku pleaded, pushing himself up onto his hands and knees. He didn't care how pathetic he looked. He needed to know. Please. Just one question. All Might paused. He looked back at the massive, reptilian teenager. He noticed the trembling in the boy's broad shoulders. I look like a monster, Izuku said, his voice dropping into a raspy, sorrowful rumble. He looked down at his clawed hands, at the dark green scales. Since I was 4, everyone has called me a villain. My quirk doesn't save people with a smile. It tears, it crushes, it scares people. Even when I try to help, I just terrify them. Izuku slowly looked up, his predatory, slit-pupil eyes meeting All Might's bright blue ones. Can someone like me, someone who looks like a beast, can I still be a hero? Can I be someone who saves people? Silence stretched across the rooftop. The wind howled softly between the antennae. All Might looked at Izuku. He saw the sheer physical power radiating from the boy's mutated frame. He saw the sharp teeth, the heavy tail, the claws that could easily shred steel. It was a terrifying visage, but beneath it, All Might saw the desperate, aching vulnerability of a child who just wanted to do good. Before All Might could answer, a sharp, stabbing pain erupted in his side. No. Not now, All Might thought, his vision blurring. Steam began to pour from his body, his massive muscles twitching. I'm out of time, Izuku gasped, scrambling backward as the number 1 hero vanished in a cloud of thick, white smoke. All Might? When the smoke cleared, the towering god of justice was gone. In his place stood a skeletal, emaciated man with hollow cheeks, baggy clothes, and a mop of unkempt blonde hair. The man coughed violently, a spray of blood splattering onto the rooftop. Izuku's jaw unhinged slightly in pure shock. What? You're not him. You're a fake. Where did All Might go? I am him. The man wheezed, wiping the blood from his chin. He slumped against the railing, exhausted. You know how guys at the pool suck in their gut to look good? It's like that. Izuku's analytical mind short-circuited. He stared at the frail man, then at the blood. All Might sighed, lifting his baggy shirt. On his left side, stretching across his ribs and abdomen, was a massive, horrific scar. It looked like a spider web of mangled flesh, sinking deep into his chest cavity. 5 years ago, All Might explained, his voice quiet, stripped of all its bombastic bravado. An enemy did this to me. My respiratory system was nearly destroyed, my stomach was removed. I can only do hero work for about 3 hours a day now. Izuku was horrified. 5 years ago? Was it Toxic Chainsaw? You know your stuff, All Might chuckled dryly. But no. This fight was kept under wraps. The world can't know the symbol of peace is failing. All Might looked out over the city skyline, leaning heavily on the railing. You asked me if someone who looks like a monster can be a hero, All Might said, his tone turning incredibly serious. He turned his sunken blue eyes toward Izuku. The truth of this profession, kid, is that perception matters. The public needs a symbol of safety. When civilians are trapped in a burning building or held hostage by a villain, they are already out of their minds with fear. When a hero arrives, their very presence needs to instantly dispel that fear. Izuku felt his heart sink into his stomach. The cold lethargy in his blood felt heavier than ever. Your quirk is undeniably powerful, All Might continued, gesturing vaguely to Izuku's massive frame. But you are right. It is a terrifying mutation. If you pull a crying child from a wreckage looking like that, in the dark, they might think they are being eaten. A hero's job is not just to defeat the bad guy. It is to make the victims feel safe. All Might sighed, looking down at his skeletal hands. I cannot simply tell you that you can be a pro-hero, young man. Not with the way society operates. It's a dangerous, cruel world. If you want to help people, if you want to use your strength. Become a police officer. They get a lot of flack, but it's a fine profession. Or join a specialized rescue squad that operates out of the public eye. All Might pushed himself off the railing. He walked toward the rooftop access door. It's not bad to dream, kid. But you have to consider what's realistic. The door clicked shut, leaving Izuku alone on the roof. Izuku didn't cry. He was too hollow to cry. He just stood there, the cold wind biting at his scales, staring at the spot where his idol had just crushed the last fragile fragment of his hope. It was exactly what everyone else had told him. Katsuki, the teachers, society. Even All Might. A monster cannot be a hero. Izuku didn't know how long he stood on the roof. When he finally forced his sluggish, heavy legs to move, he walked down the stairs in a daze. He exited the building, dragging his tail, his head hung low. He needed to get home. He needed to get into a warm bath, curl up under his heat lamps, and sleep for a week. Boom! A massive explosion shattered the afternoon quiet. Izuku stopped. His sensory pits flared wildly. The vibration wasn't just loud, it carried the distinct, heavy shockwave of a localized thermal detonation. And the smell, burnt caramel, ozone, nitroglycerin, kakin. Izuku didn't consciously decide to run. His body moved on its own. The lethargy in his limbs vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. His massive legs pumped, his heavy boots cracking the pavement with every stride. He moved with frightening speed for his size, his tail acting as a counterbalance as he rounded corners, tearing down the street toward the shopping district. When he arrived, the scene was utter chaos. Tatooine Shopping Arcade was engulfed in flames. Black smoke billowed into the sky. A crowd of civilians was pushed back against the far sidewalk, held at bay by the police. In the center of the fiery wreckage, a monstrous, gelatinous figure was rampaging, the sludge villain. Izuku's vertical pupils narrowed. He dropped the bottles. When Izuku grabbed All Might's leg, the bottles must have slipped from the hero's pockets. This was his fault. Izuku scanned the perimeter. Several pro-heroes were on the scene. Death Arms, Kamui Woods, Empty Lady, and Slugger. But they weren't fighting. It's no good. Death Arms shouted, punching a piece of falling rubble. I can't get a grip on that fluid body. And the fire is out of control. My wood will just catch fire if I get close. Kamui Woods yelled. I need 2 lanes of traffic to enlarge. I can't fit in there. Empty Lady cried in frustration. We just have to do damage control until a hero with a suitable quirk arrives. One of the police officers shouted. Izuku stared in disbelief. Waiting? They were waiting? Then Izuku saw it. Trapped deep within the swirling mass of the sludge villain, choking on the muck, was a struggling figure. The sludge had wrapped entirely around the boy's body, leaving only his mouth and eyes exposed. The boy was desperately firing off explosions from his palms, trying to blow the sludge away, but the fluid just reformed instantly, and the explosions were only feeding the surrounding fires. It was Katsuki, and Katsuki was suffocating. Izuku saw the look in Katsuki's eyes. It was a look he had never seen on the proud, arrogant boy's face. It was absolute, primal terror. Katsuki was pleading for help. You have to consider what's realistic. All Might's words echoed in his mind. They don't let kaijus into UA. Katsuki's words followed. Izuku's fists clenched. His sharp claws dug into his own thick, scaly palms. The heat from the raging fires washed over him. For a normal person, the heat was agonizing. But for Izuku's cold-blooded physiology, the extreme heat was like a shot of pure adrenaline straight to the heart. His blood boiled. His muscles swelled. The lethargy completely vanished, replaced by the terrifying, hyperactive vitality of an apex predator in its prime. He didn't think about his notebook. He didn't think about All Might. He didn't think about the crowd. Izuku Midoriya charged. Hey! Kid, get back here! Death Arms bellowed, reaching out. But Izuku was moving too fast. He tore past the police barricade, his massive boots shattering the asphalt. He let out a deep, guttural roar that echoed over the roaring flames, a sound that made the pro-heroes and the civilians flinch in biological terror. You! The sludge villain spun around, his bulbous eyes widening in shock as he saw the massive reptilian boy barreling toward him. You again? You're dead meat. The villain whipped a thick tendril of sludge at Izuku's head. Izuku didn't dodge. He lowered his head, allowing the sludge to strike the thickest, most armored part of his skull. The sludge splattered harmlessly against his osteoderms. Izuku breached the fireline. The heat was glorious. He felt stronger than he had ever felt in his life. He reached the villain. He didn't try to punch the sludge. He remembered the tunnel. Punching liquid was useless. He needed a solid anchor. He needed to cripple the villain's physical mass to force him to release Katsuki. Izuku lunged forward, his jaws unhinging with a sickening crack. He bypassed Katsuki entirely, his snout burying deep into the sludge until his sensory pits located the dense, physical mass of the villain's sensory organs, the eyes and the nerve cluster connecting them. Izuku clamped his jaws shut. 4,000 pounds per square inch. The sludge villain let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal. Ag! My eyes! Let go! Izuku didn't let go. His teeth sank deep, locking into place. But a bite wasn't enough to free Katsuki. Izuku needed to forcefully separate the villain from his hostage. His crocodilian instincts completely hijacked his body. It was a maneuver hardwired into his DNA, an execution technique perfected by millions of years of evolution to tear chunks of flesh from prey too large to swallow whole. Izuku planted his heavy feet. He tucked his arms tightly against his massive chest, and he threw his entire, 400-pound body into a violent, horizontal spin, the death roll. The sheer kinetic torque of Izuku's massive frame spinning at blinding speed was devastating. The sludge villain's fluid body couldn't withstand the rotational shear force. The mud was violently twisted, stretched, and physically ripped apart by the centrifugal energy. The spinning created a localized vortex of sludge and wind. Katsuki, who was trapped in the center, was suddenly ripped free as the sludge holding him lost its structural integrity. Katsuki was thrown clear, landing hard on the pavement, gasping violently for air. Izuku completed 3 full, violent rotations before releasing his bite. The sludge villain's central mass was shredded, splattered across the alleyway in a dozen different directions. The villain gurgled in agony, trying to pull his scattered pieces back together, but he was completely disoriented and heavily traumatized by the physical shock. Izuku landed on his feet, his chest heaving. Sludge dripped from his jaws. He spat a mouthful of muck onto the ground, his vertical pupils dilated with pure adrenaline. He stood between Katsuki and the scattered villain, his tail lashing aggressively side to side, a low, terrifying growl vibrating in his throat. The alley was dead silent, save for the crackling of the fires. The pro-heroes were frozen. The civilians were speechless. They hadn't just watched a rescue. They had watched a brutal, savage mauling. They had watched a monster tear a villain apart. Standing in the crowd, disguised in his skeletal form, Toshinori Yagi watched with wide, disbelieving eyes. He clutched his bleeding chest. He moved. While we all stood around and made excuses, that boy, heavily mutated and rejected by everyone, was the only one who moved. Toshinori felt a sickening wave of shame wash over him. He had told the boy to be realistic. He had judged him by his appearance. But in that split second, that terrifying, monstrous boy had displayed more heroism than all the pros present combined. The sludge villain began to slowly merge back together, rising furiously from the puddles. You miserable little beast! I'll kill you! Izuku braced himself, ready to charge again, ready to fight until the villain was utterly neutralized. But he didn't have to. I really am pathetic, a voice boomed, cutting through the crackle of the flames. Izuku's head snapped up. A massive, muscular figure stepped out of the smoke. All might, his body steaming, his suit straining against his expanded muscles, grabbed the remaining mass of the sludge villain by the throat. I told you the traits that make a great champion, young man, All Might said, his voice laced with blood in his mouth. He looked back at Izuku, a fierce, apologetic smile on his face. But I failed to live up to my own ideals. Pros are always risking their lives. All Might pulled his fist back. Detroit. Smash! The punch collided with the villain. The resulting air pressure was so violent it didn't just scatter the sludge, it blasted a vertical column of air straight up into the atmosphere. The sheer force of the wind blew the fires out instantly, suffocating the flames. Izuku shielded his face from the gale, his heavy tail gripping the pavement to stay grounded. A few seconds later, rain began to fall from the sky. All Might had punched the air so hard, he had changed the weather. The villain was neutralized. The fires were out. All Might stood tall in the rain, raising his fist as the crowd erupted into deafening cheers. But as the pro-heroes rushed in to secure the scene, Izuku didn't cheer. His adrenaline crashed. The cold rain hit his scales, instantly sapping the heat from his blood. The lethargy returned with a vengeance, hitting him like a physical blow. He swayed on his feet, suddenly exhausted, the animalistic rage fading back into the quiet, timid boy he truly was. The aftermath was exactly as Izuku expected. While Katsuki was surrounded by paramedics and pro-heroes praising him for his toughness and his incredible quirk for holding out so long, Izuku was pulled aside by Death Arms and Kamui Woods. He sat on a folding chair in the back of an ambulance, a thermal blanket wrapped tightly around his massive shoulders, shivering violently in the cold rain. "What were you thinking, kid?" Death Arms scolded, pointing a finger at Izuku's elongated snout. "Are you out of your mind? You charged into a burning area with no plan, no license, and engaged a villain like a feral beast. You could have gotten yourself and the hostage killed," Kamui Woods added sternly. "That death roll maneuver was completely reckless. You tore the villain apart, yes, but you could have easily broken the victim's neck in the crossfire. Leave the hero work to the professionals. You're a civilian, and frankly, you act more like a wild animal than a student." Izuku hung his head. He didn't argue. He just stared at the asphalt. "They're right. I didn't think. I just attacked like a predator. I really am a monster." Across the street, Katsuki pushed away a paramedic. He stomped over to where Izuku was sitting. The pro-heroes stepped back, expecting the victim to thank his rescuer. Katsuki stopped a few feet away. He was soaking wet, smelling of burnt sugar and sewage. He glared at Izuku, his red eyes burning with a furious, complex storm of humiliation, anger, and something close to fear. "Listen to me, swamp trash," Katsuki yelled, his voice shaking. "I didn't ask for your help. I didn't need it. I would have gotten out myself. Don't you dare think you can look down on me, you villainous freak. I'm the one going to UA. Not you." Katsuki spun around and stomped off into the rain, leaving Izuku sitting in silence. The paramedics finally cleared him to leave. Izuku stood up, wrapping his thermal jacket tightly around his chest. The walk home was excruciating. The rain chilled him to his core. Every step was agonizing. He just wanted to disappear. He wanted to go to sleep and never wake up. He turned down his street, his heavy tail leaving a serpentine trail in the wet pavement. "I am here!" Izuku violently jumped, his tail whipping around. All Might slid out from a nearby alleyway in his muscle form, striking a heroic pose. Striking a cool pose while intercepting you on your walk home. Suddenly, All Might coughed violently, a geyser of blood erupting from his mouth as he deflated into his skeletal form, leaning heavily against the telephone pole. "All Might?" Izuku gasped, rushing forward, though his cold body made him clumsy. "Are you okay? You shouldn't be pushing yourself. The press was just surrounding you." "I slipped away," Toshinori wheezed, wiping his mouth. "I had to find you. I have to apologize." Izuku stopped. "Apologize? But you were right. The heroes scolded me. Kaken yelled at me. I acted like an animal. I can't be a hero. Not looking like this." Toshinori stood up straight. He looked at the massive, scaly, terrifying boy in front of him. "Those heroes scolded you because they were ashamed," Toshinori said firmly. "They were ashamed that they stood there, making excuses about their quirks in the fire, while a child with a heavy mutation risked his life to save a boy who hates him." Izuku's vertical pupils widened. "Top heroes have stories about them from their school days," Toshinori continued, stepping closer. "Most of their stories have one thing in common: their bodies moved before they had a chance to think." Izuku's breath hitched. Tears, hot and human, welled up in his cold, reptilian eyes. "That was true for you today, wasn't it?" Toshinori asked gently. Izuku clamped a massive, clawed hand over his snout, trying to hold back the sob that tore from his throat. He fell to his knees, his heavy tail curling around him defensively. He cried, the tears falling freely onto the wet pavement. You asked me if someone who looks like a monster can be a hero, Toshinori said, looking down at the weeping titan. I told you no, because I was thinking of the symbol I created. The smiling savior. But today you proved me wrong. Toshinori placed a skeletal hand on Izuku's massive, armored shoulder. You didn't smile today. You didn't offer comforting words. You used sheer, terrifying force to break a villain and protect an innocent life. You fought like a monster, yes. But you saved him like a hero. Izuku looked up, the rain washing away his tears. Izuku Midoriya, Toshinori said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. You can become a hero. Izuku let out a deep, rumbling cry, bowing his head to the street. It was the validation he had sought for 10 years. It was the only thing he had ever wanted to hear. Toshinori let the boy cry for a few moments before speaking again. I came here to offer you something, Toshinori said. My quirk, one for all, is a sacred torch passed down from generation to generation. I initially thought to offer it to you, Izuku gasped, looking up. Your quirk? But how? It doesn't matter how, Toshinori smiled sadly. Because upon watching you fight, and reviewing your physical data, I realize I cannot give it to you, Izuku blinked. Because I'm not worthy? Because you would likely die, Toshinori corrected bluntly. Your body, young Midoriya, is already heavily saturated with an incredibly powerful, complex mutation. Your cellular structure is completely alien to a baseline human. If I were to force the stockpiled energy of one for all into your already overflowing genetics, your body would likely reject it, or worse, mutate uncontrollably and tear itself apart. Izuku swallowed hard. That made sense. His body was already a delicate balance of biology, but Toshinori said, his blue eyes flashing with determination. That does not mean I cannot help you. You don't need my power, Midoriya. You possess the jaw strength of a hydraulic press, armor that can withstand explosions, and the instincts of an apex predator. What you lack is control, technique, and a license. Toshinori held out his hand. I cannot make you the next symbol of peace, Toshinori said. But if you let me train you, if you let me mentor you for the next 10 months before the UA entrance exam. Toshinori smiled, not his boisterous all-might grin, but a genuine, proud smile. I will help you become a hero that makes the villains tremble. Izuku stared at the offered hand. He looked at his own massive, clawed fingers. He slowly reached out, wrapping his enormous hand gently around Toshinori's frail one, being careful not to let his claws nick the man's skin. Yes, Izuku rumbled, his voice filled with a fiery, unyielding resolve. Please. Train me. The rain continued to fall, washing the grime of the day away. Izuku Midoriya was still a monster. He always would be, but as he stood up, towering over the number one hero, he knew that the villains of the world were finally going to learn what it meant to be prey. The concept of strength is entirely relative. For Toshinori Yagi, strength was a reservoir of stockpiled power, a blazing sun burning in his chest that he could tap into to shatter the very air. For the average pro hero, strength might be the heat of a flame, the density of a hardened fist, or the speed of winged flight. But as Toshinori sat on a rusty folding chair on the edge of Dagoba Municipal Beach Park, a stopwatch in his skeletal hand, he realized that for Izuku Midoriya, strength was an absolute, horrifying biological given. Okay, young Midoriya, Toshinori called out, his voice competing with the sound of crashing waves and crying seagulls. Let's see your baseline pulling capacity. Whenever you're ready. 50 yards away, standing ankle-deep in the polluted, trash-choked sand, was Izuku. He was stripped down to a pair of heavy-duty cargo shorts. His chest, shoulders, and arms were fully exposed, revealing the terrifying majesty of his mutation. Deep, forest-green scales formed thick, interlocking plates of armor across his pectorals and abdominals. His back was a landscape of jagged osteoderms, bony ridges that ran down his spine and merged seamlessly into the massive, 5-foot tail resting heavily on the sand. Around Izuku's broad chest, a thick industrial towing chain was wrapped securely. The other end of the chain was hooked to the front bumper of an abandoned, rust-eaten pickup truck half buried in a dune of garbage. Izuku didn't stretch. He didn't hype himself up. He simply dug his digitigrade, three-toed, clawed feet into the sand. He leaned forward, dropping his center of gravity, his tail laying flat to anchor him, his vertical slit pupils dilated. His jaw parted, a low, guttural hiss vibrating from his chest, and he pulled. There was no explosive shout, no flashy burst of light. There was only the brutal, mechanical application of crocodilian muscle. Creak! The heavy chain snapped taut, pulling perfectly straight. The rusted metal of the truck's bumper groaned in protest. For a second, the truck didn't move. Then, Izuku's massive thighs bulged. His claws dug deeper, finding purchase against the bedrock beneath the sand. Crunch! The pickup truck was violently dislodged from the sand dune. Izuku didn't just pull it, he dragged it. He marched forward, step by heavy step, hauling the 2-ton vehicle across the beach as if it were a stubborn dog on a leash. The tires squealed, the rusted undercarriage grinding over broken glass and discarded washing machines. But Izuku didn't slow down. He dragged it a full 20 yards before the rusted bumper completely sheared off, sending Izuku stumbling slightly forward. Toshinori clicked his stopwatch, his jaw hanging slightly open. Izuku turned around, panting softly, white condensation escaping his nostrils. He nervously rubbed the back of his neck, instantly shrinking into his characteristic slouch. Sorry, All Might. I pulled too hard and broke the anchor point. I can go find another chain. Midoriya, my boy, Toshinori breathed, standing up and walking over. He looked at the sheared metal of the bumper, then up at the 14-year-old. Do you have any idea how much kinetic force you just casually exerted? Izuku looked down at his clawed hands. I guess a lot? A lot is an understatement, Toshinori said, pulling a small notepad from his oversized coat. Over the last week of baseline testing, you crushed a steel beam with a bite force exceeding 4,000 psi. You ran a 100-meter dash in 8 seconds, which would be faster if you didn't have to carry a 100-pound tail. And you just casually dead-dragged 2 tons through loose sand. Toshinori put the notepad away and looked Izuku directly in his predatory eyes. You do not need strength training. If I put you on a traditional weightlifting regimen, we'd just be wasting time. Your body is already operating at the pinnacle of physical power for a mutant of your classification. Izuku's shoulders slumped. So, what do we do? If I can't get stronger, how do I train? By realizing that raw power is your biggest liability, Toshinori answered, his tone turning dead serious. Midoriya, if you use your full strength on a common purse snatcher, you will break them in half. If you bite a villain with a physical quirk, you will amputate their limbs. Your mutation is designed for one thing, the brutal, efficient termination of prey. Izuku flinched, the words stinging him. He wrapped his tail around his legs, a subconscious gesture of distress. I know. I'm a monster. No, Toshinori corrected sharply, stepping closer and placing a skeletal hand on Izuku's scaled arm. You are a young man with a dangerous tool. And a tool can be mastered. Our goal for the next 10 months isn't to make you stronger. It is to give you absolute, surgical control over the beast. We are going to forge an iron cage of restraint around your instincts. You must learn to use 10% of your power, and hold the other 90% back, even in the heat of battle. Izuku nodded slowly, the logic appealing to his analytical mind. Control. Restraint. Exactly. But before we tackle combat restraint, we must tackle your most glaring, biological weakness. Toshinori turned, pointing a bony finger out toward the ocean. The waters of Dagoba Bay were gray, choppy, and choked with floating debris. But worse than the trash was the temperature. It was late autumn. The water was near freezing. Your quirk classifies you as ectothermic, Toshinori said. A cold-blooded organism. When exposed to low temperatures, your metabolism plummets, your muscles stiffen, and you enter a state of extreme lethargy. Am I correct? Izuku shivered just looking at the water. Why, yes. If it gets too cold, my brain just shuts off. I go to sleep. It's called brimation. It's like hibernation for reptiles. Villains will not wait for a warm summer afternoon to attack, Toshinori said grimly. If you are caught in a blizzard, or forced to fight an ice user, or submerged in freezing water to rescue a drowning civilian, you cannot afford to fall asleep. You must train your mind to override your body's biological kill switch. Toshinori walked over to a nearby tarp and pulled it back. Underneath were thick, heavy-duty diving chains, reinforced grappling hooks, and a stack of thermal blankets and a massive thermos of hot chicken broth. Dagoba Beach is famous for its illegal dumping, Toshinori explained. But the trash on the sand is only half the problem. The bay itself is littered with sunken cars, refrigerators, and industrial waste. Your task for the next 3 months, young Midoriya, is to dive into that freezing water, hook the heavy debris, and drag it to shore. Izuku stared at the gray, churning ocean. The wind coming off the water was already making his joints ache. The idea of completely submerging himself in that icy abyss felt like a death sentence. His crocodilian instincts were screaming at him to find a heat lamp, to curl up and sleep. Toshinori noticed his hesitation. It will be agonizing. Your body will fight you every step of the way. But I will be right here on the shore. If you lose consciousness, I will dive in and pull you out. I will not let you drown. Do you trust me? Izuku looked away from the ocean, looking down at the frail, skeletal man who had once been the most powerful being on the planet. All Might had sacrificed his body, his stomach, his respiratory system, to save people. He had fought through unimaginable pain. If his idol could fight with a destroyed body, Izuku could fight the cold. Izuku's jaw set into a determined scowl. He reached down, picking up the heavy diving chains and looping them over his broad shoulders in a crisscross pattern. The metal was freezing against his bare scales, but he didn't flinch. I trust you, Izuku rumbled. He turned and marched toward the water. The first plunge was a nightmare. The moment the dark, freezing water of Dagoba Bay crested over Izuku's armored chest, his body initiated a full-scale panic response. It wasn't human panic. It was deeply reptilian. His heart rate, normally a steady, thrumming beat, plummeted violently. His blood vessels constricted, retreating from his extremities to protect his vital organs. His limbs felt like they were filled with lead. His massive tail, usually an agile and powerful rudder, became a dead weight dragging behind him. Sleep, his brain whispered. It is cold. There is no prey. Shut down. Sleep. Izuku waded deeper, the water rising to his thick neck. He clamped his jaws shut, his palatal valve sealing his throat automatically. He took a deep, shuddering breath through his nostrils, completely filling his massive lungs, and dove under. The underwater world was murky and brown, choked with silt and rust. Izuku's nictitating membranes, clear secondary eyelids, slid sideways across his eyes, protecting them from the salt water and debris while allowing him to see. His slit pupils dilated to their absolute maximum, drawing in whatever dim light penetrated the gloom. Through the murky water he saw it. A rusted, waterlogged commercial refrigerator, half buried in the muddy seabed 20 feet down. Izuku kicked his legs, trying to swim toward it. The movement was agonizing. Every muscle contraction felt like tearing Velcro. The lethargy was suffocating. He felt incredibly drunk, his thoughts blurring, his vision narrowing. Just close your eyes, the instinct begged. Just rest on the bottom for a minute. Just a minute. No! Izuku's human mind screamed, violently resisting. I have to save people. I have to be a hero. Move. Move. He fought his own biology. He forced his heavy arms forward, reaching the sunken refrigerator. His clawed hands gripped the rusted metal, his fingers numb and clumsy. He took the heavy hook attached to his chains and wedged it under the appliance's motor block. Click. He was secured. Now came the hard part. Izuku planted his feet in the silt. He grabbed the chain. And he began to walk backward, up the incline of the seabed, toward the shore. The resistance was unimaginable. The water fought him, the mud fought him, the immense weight of the waterlogged metal fought him. But his greatest enemy was his own cold-blooded heart, struggling to pump oxygen to his stiff muscles. It took him 5 minutes just to move 10 feet. His lungs were burning, but not for air, they burned with the chill of the water. His vision began to tunnel. Black spots danced on the edges of his sight. He broke the surface of the water, gasping violently. The freezing autumn wind hit his wet scales, accelerating the heat loss. Keep going, Midoriya. Toshinori's voice carried over the wind. You're doing it. Fight the cold. Force your heart to beat. Izuku let out a guttural, terrifying roar, a sound of pure defiance. He dug his claws into the wet sand at the shoreline and pulled. He dragged the massive refrigerator out of the surf, his muscles trembling so violently they looked like vibrating guitar strings. He hauled it up onto the dry sand, and then, his legs simply gave out. He collapsed onto his side, his heavy tail slamming against the beach. He couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the cold. Toshinori was there in an instant. He threw a massive, heated thermal blanket over Izuku's trembling form. He unscrewed the thermos and poured a steaming cup of high-sodium chicken broth, kneeling beside the boy's massive head. Drink, Toshinori ordered gently, pressing the cup to Izuku's scaly lips. Izuku drank, the scalding liquid tracing a line of glorious heat down his throat and into his stomach. The warmth began to radiate outward. Slowly, painfully, he regained control of his fingers. You did it, my boy, Toshinori said softly, rubbing Izuku's armored shoulder through the blanket. You conquered your own nature. I almost fell asleep, Izuku chattered, his teeth clicking together loudly. It was so heavy, but you didn't, Toshinori smiled. You chose to move. That human willpower overriding biological instinct, that is the heart of a hero. Now, rest for 5 minutes. Let your core temperature stabilize. Toshinori looked out at the bay. There are about 200 more heavy appliances down there. We have a long winter ahead of us, Izuku groaned, closing his eyes. But beneath the blanket, he smiled. The next 3 months were a crucible of ice and iron. As November turned into December, and December into the bitter frost of January, the water grew colder. Izuku spent 4 hours a day submerged in the freezing bay. The pain never went away. The biological urge to hibernate remained a constant, screaming presence in the back of his mind. But Izuku learned to cage it. He learned how to compartmentalize the cold, isolating the sensation of freezing in a corner of his mind while forcing his body to act on pure adrenaline. His body adapted. His heart muscle grew thicker, pumping blood with more forceful, concussive beats to overcome the chill. His scales grew slightly darker, absorbing whatever meager sunlight was available to retain heat. By the end of January, a massive pile of rusted cars, washing machines, safes, and engine blocks sat on the shoreline. Izuku could now stay submerged in freezing water for 45 minutes without losing consciousness, moving with a heavy, terrifying grace along the ocean floor. He had conquered the cold, but Toshinori knew that enduring the elements was only the first step. The real danger lay in what would happen when the cold was gone, and the heat of battle ignited the predator within. Spring arrived in late February, bringing a slight thaw to the air. The water was still cold, but the ambient temperature on the beach was rising. With the heat came a surge of vitality in Izuku's ectothermic body. His metabolism spiked, and with it, his energy. He felt powerful. Too powerful. Izuku was dragging a pair of rusted truck axles across the sand when a massive, heavy object slammed into his back. The impact was entirely silent, bearing no warning. Izuku didn't even have time to turn around. He was sent sprawling into the sand, dropping his chains. Instantly, his predatory instincts flared. Ambush. Threat. Kill. Izuku roared, spinning around and whipping his heavy tail in a sweeping arc. But the attacker wasn't there. Izuku sprang to his feet, his claws extended, his jaws parted, his sensory pits flaring wildly to detect vibrations in the air. He heard a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't Crocodile. It was Canine. Sitting on top of the pile of salvaged refrigerators, smoking a cigar and glaring down at Izuku, was a towering man with the head of a massive, heavily scarred mastiff. Your reaction time is garbage, kid, Pro-Hero Hound Dog rumbled, a plume of smoke escaping his jowls. You rely entirely on your eyes. If an enemy attacks you from your blind spot, you just thrash around like a panicked gator. That'll get you killed. Or worse, it'll get a civilian killed when you accidentally crush them in your panic. Izuku blinked, his aggressive posture fading into confusion. He looked past the massive dog man and saw Toshinori standing a few yards away, holding 2 cups of coffee. Ah, Ryo! You made it! Toshinori smiled, holding out a cup. Hound Dog hopped down from the refrigerators, his heavy boots crunching in the sand. He took the coffee, nodding gruffly to the number 1 hero. Tashinori. You called in a hell of a favor. I'm a guidance counselor, not a combat instructor. You are exactly what he needs, Tashinori said, gesturing to Izuku. Izuku quickly bowed, his tail swaying nervously. It's an honor to meet you, Hound Dog, sir. I've analyzed your arrest records. Your tracking abilities and psychological warfare tactics are incredible. Hound Dog narrowed his eyes, studying the massive, scaly boy. He stepped close, sniffing the air around Izuku. Smells like fear, Hound Dog grunted. Smells like a kid who's terrified of his own shadow. Tashinori tells me you've got a restraint problem. That you fight like a beast because you don't know how to fight like a man. Izuku swallowed hard, looking down. My body just acts. When I'm threatened, or when someone is hurt, my brain goes to the back seat. My instincts take over. I bit a villain. I nearly tore him apart with a death roll. I didn't even think about it. Hound Dog's expression softened slightly, though his canine face made it hard to tell. He took a drag of his cigar. Heteromorphs with predator mutations all deal with the same curse, kid, Hound Dog said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, serious tone. Society looks at us and sees villains, so we constantly try to prove we're civilized. We wear nice suits, we speak politely, we suppress our instincts. But the beast is always there, and if you lock a beast in a cage and never let it out, it goes mad. When it finally breaks loose, it's uncontrollable. Hound Dog pointed a clawed finger at Izuku's chest. You can't cage the crocodile, Midoriya. You have to train it. You have to learn how to open the cage door, let the beast do exactly what you want it to do, and then put it back. You need to control the bloodlust. How? Izuku asked desperately. By taking away your eyes, Hound Dog said, pulling a thick leather blindfold from his trench coat. He threw it at Izuku. Put that on. Izuku hesitated, then tied the leather tightly over his eyes, plunging himself into darkness. You have sensory pits on your jaw, correct? Hound Dog asked, beginning to pace silently around Izuku. And an advanced olfactory system. Your nose and those pits are your real weapons. Not your eyes. Eyes can be tricked by light quirks, smoke, or illusions. Vibrations and scent don't lie. Izuku focused. With his vision gone, the world exploded into a cacophony of sound and feeling. He could feel the tiny vibrations of Hound Dog's boots shifting the sand. He could smell the tobacco smoke, the wet dog scent, the salt in the air. Track me, Hound Dog ordered. For the next 3 hours, Izuku was subjected to grueling sensory deprivation training. Hound Dog moved with unnatural stealth, darting around the beach. Izuku had to intercept him, blocking strikes and grabbing the hero. At first, Izuku failed miserably. He was too slow, reacting to the sound of Hound Dog's movements rather than the vibrations. He got knocked into the sand dozens of times, his scales taking the brunt of Hound Dog's heavy punches. Stop thinking! Hound Dog barked, kicking sand at the blindfolded boy. You're trying to use human logic to process animal senses. Let the instinct guide you. Feel the pressure in the air. Izuku took a deep breath. He stopped trying to calculate trajectories. He opened his jaws slightly, exposing the sensitive pits along his gum line to the wind. Shift. There. A displacement of air pressure to his left. Izuku didn't think. He spun, his heavy tail whipping around in a perfect counterbalance, and shot his massive hand out. His claws clamped firmly around Hound Dog's thick wrist just as the hero was about to deliver a punch to his ribs. Good, Hound Dog grunted, surprised by the speed. Now here's the real test. Suddenly, the smell in the air changed. The scent of tobacco was replaced by a sharp, pungent metallic odor. Blood. Hound Dog had crushed a vial of synthetic blood against his own chest. The moment the scent hit Izuku's olfactory receptors, a terrifying, primal switch flipped in his brain. Prey. Injured. Weak. Kill. A low, vibrating hiss erupted from Izuku's chest. The blindfold tore as his jaw unhinged, his muscles bulging with sudden, uncontrollable aggression. The rational, human part of Izuku, the part that loved all might and took notes in class, was suddenly drowned beneath a tidal wave of biological bloodlust. Izuku yanked Hound Dog forward by the wrist. He didn't use a martial arts throw, He used brute, crocodilian force, slamming the massive hero into the sand. Izuku mounted him, his jaws snapping open, aiming directly for Hound Dog's throat. Midoriya! Stop! Tashinori shouted from the sidelines, stepping forward. But Izuku didn't hear him. The beast was entirely out of the cage. He lunged, his teeth mere inches from tearing Hound Dog's jugular. Smack! Hound Dog didn't flinch. He simply raised his free hand and delivered a sharp, stinging slap directly to the sensitive tip of Izuku's snout. The pain wasn't immense, but it was highly disorienting. It shocked the predatory brain just enough for Izuku's human consciousness to claw its way back to the surface. Izuku froze, his jaws clamped around empty air, hovering millimeters above Hound Dog's neck. He was panting heavily, a drop of drool falling from his sharp teeth onto Hound Dog's coat. Izuku realized what he was doing. He scrambled backward in absolute horror, ripping the blindfold off. He clutched his own head, trembling violently. I almost... Izuku choked, his eyes wide with terror. I almost killed you. I couldn't stop it. The smell, it just took over. Tashinori rushed over, looking highly alarmed. But Hound Dog simply sat up, brushing the sand off his coat with a calm, unimpressed expression. Exactly, Hound Dog said, pulling out a fresh cigar. That is the bloodlust. That is the instinct that tells you to finish the job. If you face a villain who is bleeding, or if you smell blood on a battlefield, that instinct will trigger. You can't stop it from triggering. Hound Dog stood up, walking over to the trembling boy. He didn't offer a comforting pat. He offered harsh, necessary reality. You have a choice, Midoriya, Hound Dog growled. You can let the bloodlust control the steering wheel, and end up murdering a villain in cold blood. Or you can acknowledge the urge, feel the desire to bite, and choose to close your jaw. You have to train the restraint into your muscle memory. You have to hold the bite. For the next 2 months, the training shifted from the physical to the deeply psychological. Hound Dog put Izuku through hell. He set up scenarios designed to trigger Izuku's deepest predatory instincts. He used synthetic blood, simulated screams of distress, and sudden, violent ambushes. Every time Izuku lost control and went for a lethal bite or a death roll, Hound Dog would violently break his focus, forcing him to reset. It was emotionally exhausting. Izuku spent many nights sitting in his heated bathtub at home, crying silently as he grappled with the terrifying darkness inside his own mind. He was intimately acquainted with his capacity for violence. He knew, with absolute certainty, how easy it would be to kill, but slowly, surely, the iron cage of restraint was built. By the end of May, Izuku could stand completely still, breathing in the scent of fresh blood, surrounded by chaotic noise, without losing his rational thought. The beast was awake, pacing in its cage, but Izuku held the key. He learned to channel the aggression into speed and focus, rather than lethal force. He learned how to hold the bite. With the cold conquered and the bloodlust caged, it was time to forge Izuku Midoriya into a weapon of precise, non-lethal justice. Summer blanketed the beach in sweltering heat. The sun baked the sand, and Izuku was in his absolute prime. His scales practically hummed with energy, his ectothermic body absorbing the solar radiation and converting it into limitless stamina. Tashinori, now in his muscle form, stood opposite Izuku on a cleared patch of hard-packed sand. Your raw physical stats are phenomenal, young Midoriya, All Might boomed, holding his massive hands up in a sparring stance. But you fight like a brawler, you swing wild, and you rely entirely on your arms and teeth. You are ignoring 50% of your body mass. Izuku crouched low, his tail swaying. My tail? But it's so heavy, it throws off my balance when I throw a punch. Then don't throw a human punch. All Might laughed. You are not built like a human. Stop trying to imitate standard martial arts. We must develop a style entirely unique to your physiology. Let's call it Croc style. All Might lunged forward, throwing a slow but incredibly heavy right hook. Izuku instinctively raised his arms to block, crossing them over his face. The punch connected with his forearms, the sheer force sliding him backward through the sand. Wrong! All Might shouted, dropping his stance. Why are you blocking with your arms? Your arms have relatively thin scales. Where is your heaviest armor? Izuku blinked. My back. Exactly. The osteoderms on your back and shoulders can withstand anti-tank weaponry. If an enemy strikes you, you don't face them head-on, you turn. All Might attacked again, throwing a roundhouse kick. This time, Izuku didn't raise his arms. He pivoted on his heavy feet, spinning his torso away from the attack and presenting his broad, jagged back to All Might. Clang! All Might's shin collided with the bony ridges of Izuku's spine. The impact sounded like striking an anvil. Izuku felt the kinetic force push him, but there was zero pain. The armor absorbed it perfectly. Excellent! All Might praised. Use your shell! You are a walking fortress. Now, counterattack! Izuku spun back around, pulling his arm back for a punch. Too slow. All Might ducked under the punch and tapped Izuku's ribs. Your arms are thick, but they lack reach. What is your longest limb? Izuku looked back at his tail. For the next 3 months, All Might and Hound Dog worked together to teach Izuku how to move. They deconstructed his human habits and built a fighting style centered entirely around his crocodilian anatomy. Izuku learned that his tail wasn't just a rudder. It was a devastating bludgeoning weapon. He learned to use centrifugal force, spinning his body to deliver tail whips that could shatter concrete pillars without causing lethal penetrating trauma to an opponent. He learned to fight on all fours. His digitigrade legs and thick arms allowed him to drop into a quadrupedal sprint, increasing his speed exponentially, and making him a terrifying, low-profile target that was incredibly difficult to hit. But the most important technique he mastered was grappling. You cannot bite them, Hound Dog instructed, watching Izuku wrestle with a heavily padded training dummy. But you have the bite force to hold them. Use your jaws to trap weapons, not limbs. Izuku practiced catching steel pipes and wooden bats in his mouth, clamping down with just enough force to shatter the weapon without severing the dummy's arm. He also developed a signature submission hold. Instead of punching an opponent into unconsciousness, Izuku learned to use his massive weight. He would tackle the enemy, using his 400-pound bulk to pin them to the ground. Then, he would wrap his heavy tail completely around their torso, locking their arms to their sides in a crushing, inescapable embrace. The Gator Lock, All Might dubbed it proudly. Non-lethal, inescapable, and completely terrifying. It is perfect. By the end of August, the beach was nearly clean. The mountain of rusted cars and appliances was gone, hauled away by recycling trucks Toshinori had coordinated. The sand was white, and the bay was crystal clear. Izuku was no longer a clumsy, slouching boy terrified of his own shadow. He stood tall, his posture perfectly straight, carrying his massive frame with the quiet, terrifying grace of an apex predator perfectly in tune with its environment. His dark green scales polished by the sand and salt water, his muscles defined and corded with coiled power, he looked like a god of the swamp. February 26th. The morning of the UA entrance exam. The air was crisp and brutally cold, a final bite of winter before the spring thaw. The sky above Dagoba Beach was painted in hues of deep violet and fiery orange as the sun slowly crested over the horizon. Toshinori Yagi stood on the seawall, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his oversized coat. He looked out over the beach. It was completely, utterly spotless. The sand swept cleanly for miles. The water lapped gently against the shore, free of oil, rust, and garbage. It was a beautiful sight, but more beautiful than the clean beach was the figure standing at the edge of the water. Izuku Midoriya stood facing the rising sun. He wore a pair of dark, custom-fitted athletic pants, his chest and back completely bare to the freezing morning air. But he wasn't shivering. He wasn't slouching. He stood at his full 6'5" height, his heavy tail resting proudly on the clean sand. He was absorbing the first rays of sunlight, his cold-blooded physiology soaking in the heat. Toshinori walked down the stairs, his boots crunching softly on the sand. Izuku heard him approach, his sensory pits picking up the vibration, and turned around. The boy's face was still a terrifying visage. The heavy snout, the jagged teeth, the vertical slit pupils. It was the face of a monster. But as Izuku looked at Toshinori, the predatory coldness in his eyes was replaced by a deep, profound warmth. Izuku smiled. It wasn't a human smile, and it certainly wasn't the brilliant, comforting grin of All Might. It was a toothy, intimidating crocodilian smirk. But it was genuine. It's done, Izuku rumbled, his deep voice harmonizing with the crashing waves. The ocean is clear. Toshinori looked around, feeling a lump form in his throat. 10 months ago, a weeping, terrified boy had begged for a chance on a rainy street. Now, a titan stood before him, forged in ice, iron, and unimaginable discipline. You did more than clean a beach, young Midoriya, Toshinori said softly, stepping up to the boy. You conquered your own nature. You took a body designed for slaughter and tuned it into an instrument of protection. I have never seen such willpower. Toshinori reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular card. It was a provisional registration for the UA entrance exam. They will judge you today, Toshinori said, holding the card out. The other students will look at you with fear. The examiners will look at you with skepticism. They will expect a wild beast. They will expect a villain. Izuku took the card carefully between two massive, obsidian claws. He looked down at it, tracing the UA logo. What are you going to show them, Midoriya? Toshinori asked, his blue eyes flashing. Izuku closed his eyes. He thought of the freezing water. He thought of the burning bloodlust hound dog had forced him to conquer. He thought of the sludge villain, and the terror in Katsuki's eyes. He opened his eyes, staring directly into the rising sun. I'm going to show them, Izuku rumbled, his chest vibrating with suppressed power, that a monster can be a shield. Izuku turned toward the ocean. He took a deep breath, filling his massive lungs. He threw his arms wide, his dorsal ridges flexing, his tail lashing behind him. He let out a roar. It was not the panicked, feral hiss of a frightened animal. It was a deafening, earth-shattering bellow, a primal sound that shook the sand and echoed across the bay. It was a roar that declared dominance, not to terrorize but to protect. It was the roar of a guardian beast claiming its territory. Toshinori watched the silhouette of the massive boy framed against the sunrise. The wind whipped at his skeletal frame, but he felt a profound warmth in his chest. He couldn't pass on one for all to this boy. But as Toshinori watched Izuku roar at the dawn, he realized that he didn't need to. Heroes Society had spent decades cultivating a pristine, smiling image of justice. But the world was dark, and villains were cruel. Perhaps, Toshinori thought, the world no longer needed a smiling symbol of peace. Perhaps the world needed a monster to fight the monsters. Go, young Midoriya, Toshinori whispered to the wind. Show them the apex hero.